Everybody was scared. It's one of them I don't know, and what do you do about it?
In 1972, the quiet community of Vernal, Utah was scarred by a crime that would go unsolved for more than 50 years. 21-year-old Gregory Nickell was murdered, and an 18-year-old woman was abducted and raped.
I said, "Where is Greg?" And she says, "They killed him."
That's what investigators say happened, but for 5 decades were unable to prove and solve the case. I'm Jim Spiewak, and in this special, I'll take you through the evidence, the investigation, and the advancements in DNA technology that finally led investigators to the 2 men they say committed these crimes, one of which is still alive.
It was scary, and it's been the talk of Vernal for ever since it's happened.
Let me take you back in time to where this tragedy begins. November 1972, on this lookout point just to the west of the city of Vernal. 21-year-old Gregory Nickell had just returned from his service in the military, and he was in his car with his 18-year-old date at this lookout point when a total stranger came up to their window, said that he had broken down just off of Highway 40 and needed some help, and that's when that stranger pulled out a pistol, shooting and killing Gregory Nickell, ending his life and changing the life of his date forever. Taken from the victim's account to investigators, in his final moments, Nickell used his body to shield her from the gunfire. But the killer forced his way into the car, pushed Nickell's body on top of her, and took control of the vehicle. Since we were unable to contact the victim and she is a victim of rape, we decided not to use her name.
I remember when it happened. Vernal was a peaceful, quiet town, and it's the first murder I can ever remember.
A second man in another vehicle joined the killer. Marvin Capps has lived in Vernal since before the murder.
Our little town got scary. We was afraid to go out after dark because we didn't know what happened. Things just like that didn't happen around here.
The 2 suspects then brought the victims here to what is now known as Bruff Reservoir, about 20 miles away from where the initial shooting happened. Nickell still technically had a pulse at this time, but he wasn't alive for very much longer because the suspects then lit the car on fire with Nickell inside and proceeded to rape the female victim for the first time. Investigators later determined that a hole in the gas tank had been caused by a large caliber firearm, suggesting the suspects had another weapon with them that night. But the horror didn't end there. The 2 men drove around for hours on back roads, debating what to do with Nickell's date, who was still alive. During those few hours, the men referred to each other by nicknames like Tex, Johnny, and George. The victim remembered them talking about ranch work, horses, and even claiming one of them had the ability to read minds.
Burned in my head for the rest of my life. I've never forgotten hardly a minute of that night.
Lynette Ray grew up in Vernal but moved away in the 1980s. She's also Greg's sister. Lynette says Greg's date that night was her roommate.
I had the same roommates for a couple of years. They had talked to Greg on the phone. They'd see pictures of how attractive he was. And of course, the fact that he wore a uniform didn't hurt. And they were Google-eyed over Greg. They wanted to go meet him. So I took them home, and he hit it off with one of my roommates.
Greg invited Lynette's roommate to spend the 1972 Thanksgiving holiday in Vernal. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, Lynette and her roommates got ready to head back to school the next day. That evening, they asked Lynette to join them, but she declined.
So I can see the 2 of them leaving as they walked out that door. And he said to my father, mother, and myself, "Catch you later, folks," and went out the door. And that was the last thing I knew.
When Greg didn't return home, she started to get restless.
And about 5 o'clock, my mother yelled up the stairs for me to get up. She says, "Do you have any idea where Greg might be? They haven't come home. And Greg promised that he would be here to go to work with your dad this morning, and he's not home. Where can we look?"
Lynette didn't know it at the time, but that was the moment a 52-year search for a killer began.
I went out to the car, and my mother followed me out, and she said, "Be sure and keep your doors locked, and don't open them for anyone." And I looked at her, and I said, "Mom, you got to be kidding." I said, "This is Vernal, Utah." And I kind of scoffed it, laughed at it, and left.
Lynette checked a few popular hangout spots where she thought they might be.
The first place I went was the Scenic View. Of course, at that time of the morning, the sun was just coming up, and there was nobody there. No vehicles of any kind. And I wasn't looking for expelled shells on the ground. I had no idea.
There was no sign of either of them. After driving around back roads for several hours, the two suspects stopped here in Duchesne City. That's where they raped the female victim for a second time and finally let her go, telling her to walk to a nearby farmhouse where she was able to get help. And it was just a short time later the sheriff pulled up to Lynette's house. The sheriff got out with Greg's date.
She was wearing my brother's down jacket, the one that he had left, that he had on when he left the house. And I took one look at her and I said, "Where's Greg?" And she didn't answer me. She just shook her head. And I said, "Where is Greg?" And she says, "They killed him."
What ran through your mind the moment she said they killed him?
I just couldn't imagine. Who killed him? Greg was loved by everyone. He came home a hero.
A small town without their hero.
Everybody was scared. It's one of them I don't know, and what do you do about it?
Investigators and Nickell's family immediately began to ask, who are the suspects? An answer that took more than 50 years to get. After the crime, more than 30 pieces of evidence were sent to the lab for analysis, but investigators in 1972 could only piece together a partial picture of the crime. Whitney Jackson lives in Vernal, and her father has worked on cracking this case.
It's pretty amazing, I think, that the circumstances allowed all the evidence to be kept for so long and be able to be used still, and that we were able to use all of the things that they didn't know what to do with at the time back then.
DNA technology would not come online for another 20 years. Amy Newman is now the lab director for the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services.
Sometimes there are cases that have continued to be worked throughout the years, and then sometimes we get evidence that the packaging hasn't been opened since the 1950s.
Despite the victim's testimony, collection of DNA evidence, and items at the scene, the case went cold. But the swabs collected from the victim and other evidence were preserved. That and the Book Cliffs connection would become turning points decades later. Decades passed, no movement in the case. Then in the early 2000s, a major development. The State Crime Lab, using DNA evidence from the crime back in the 70s, identified two male profiles. One of the men, Arthur Bell. Bell lived in the Uinta Basin at the time of the murder. In 2020, the lab confirmed that one of the two DNA profiles matched Bell, but he died the year before.
They didn't wear gloves when they were collecting evidence, and so we do have to keep in mind when we're developing profiles, it's good to rule out the person that collected the evidence.
The second DNA profile stayed unsolved until genealogy pointed to the surname Choate. Investigators focused on Daryl Eugene Choate, who had a long criminal history, including sexual offenses. In 2024, police matched his DNA to the crime scene. Newman says the DNA was the missing link, but advancements in technology were needed to make an arrest.
It's particularly helpful when we're dealing with samples that involve complex DNA mixtures, so mixtures of up to about 4 people, or low levels of DNA, or degraded DNA.
Choate, now living in Tooele, Utah, was arrested on October 30th, 2024. The Utah State Lab estimates the chance of DNA error at less than 1 in 6 trillion.
Back in the day, it was like you have to have a whole towel full of blood, and nowadays it's DNA that you can't even see with the naked eye.
Now let's take you into the complex world of unsolved crimes and the efforts being made to bring justice to families waiting for answers. DNA first became a crime-solving tool in 1992, and 30 years later, Utah's Bureau of Forensic Services leads the field. In 2024 alone, the lab generated 7,000 DNA reports.
We do latent print analysis, we test for controlled substances, we do firearms analysis, and we do digital forensics.
Amy Newman, the lab director for the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services, says that the technology has come so far in just the last few years.
We have gone in the last 30 years from needing a quarter size of blood to just the tiniest fleck of blood. It'd be about 2,500 cells is what we used to need, and now we need around 50.
In 2023, Utah introduced probabilistic genotyping, a data analysis method that decodes complex DNA mixtures involving several people, low-level samples, or degraded DNA.
So things before then, we would have to say were inconclusive because they were too complicated to analyze, and now we can analyze them.
The National DNA Database, known as KUTV, includes DNA from all over the country. The more samples it has, the better the odds of generating leads in cases without suspects. Newer techniques like YSTR analysis has also become a game changer. This process tracks lineages through DNA even when individual profiles cannot be identified.
It's passed through father to son to grandson, runs through the male line.
DNA evidence is highly resilient if stored properly. That's why cases from decades ago are still being cracked today. Newman says DNA is best stored in paper bags and in dry areas.
If it's kept packaged properly, then it can stick around for a really long time.
Newman says in her experience, investigators from decades ago preserved evidence really well. Even though some of it has been initially tested, retesting happens often if there's enough evidence to do so. And investigators regularly retest old evidence using today's advanced methods. Newman says that the results don't lie. There's really no getting around DNA evidence.
It's absolutely unique to an individual. And in the analysis, part of it is we issue a statistic that says how likely it is that that DNA would be associated with somebody else.
DNA helped Utah clear a massive backlog of unsolved sexual assault kits. In 2015, Steve O'Cam was brought in to help clear that backlog.
I tell people literally this is like the golden age of cold cases and DNA testing.
By 2016, Utah began testing more than 1,700 backlogged kits. In 2020, all of those kits in the state had been tested, and it was an unprecedented turnaround that laid the groundwork for further innovations in cracking cold cases.
I mean, lots of people like to put puzzles together. We're putting together 10,000 piece puzzles with tiny pieces all the time, trying to figure out how to make it into a final version.
A key tool in working on that puzzle, genetic genealogy. Using DNA from a crime scene, it looks for relatives, pulling from public records and social media to build a family tree. In 2023, Utah created a law spelling out how it's used.
We're here to just obtain the truth, right? Uncover whatever that truth may be. And to use every ethical, legal tool we can.
It's important to note that information from these databases is only an investigative lead. Once a suspect is identified, traditional testing must confirm the match before charges can be filed.
I don't think the case was solvable back then. It took this advance in DNA, most of all, to get this done.
Back in Vernal, nearly a lifetime later, that's exactly how Choate was identified as a suspect, arrested, and charged with Nickell's murder.
It's awesome to have put it all together, because there were times in that case where we thought there was no hope that anyone would ever be identified in terms of the second suspect.
The crack in Nickell's case started when O'Cam was doing outreach in Uinta County in Vernal.
So I was just teaching out there, talking about stuff we had available in, I think it was 2020, and the lead detective was sitting there and he's like, "Hey, I think I've got a case for you after." So we met, he showed me the picture on the wall and told me the story. Almost brought me to tears, and I was in.
Advanced DNA testing is expensive. Grant money helped Uinta County afford it.
Especially rural agencies, smaller agencies, they don't have the budget to write a $2,000 or a $5,000 or $8,000 or $10,000 check for a technology they don't know if it'll help them solve the case.
SBI has received 2 grants which have proven vital in cases like Nickell's, which O'Cam believes is the oldest cold case currently being prosecuted in the country in early 2025.
Will there ever be a day where cold cases will be gone?
That's absolutely the goal of this technology, is to end the serial killer for sure.
What's the last 52 years felt like for you up until this advancement in DNA technology? What has that feeling been like? Has it been a helpless feeling? Has it been no closure? What has that feeling been like for you and your family?
It hasn't been helpless because I have gotten hands-on with the law enforcement as much as possible. And I really feel like I was an aid in a lot of it. I felt short of breath, and that sounds terrible to feel like you're short of breath for 52 years, but I did. I was constantly waiting. I just would look at my phone every day and wait for a text, or is today going to be the day?
And what was the feeling when you finally did get the text?
I felt like a 50-pound, literally, like a 50-pound brick had been removed from my chest. And I took my first real deep breath I felt in a long, many years. It was such a relief.
Lynette never imagined a suspect would be found alive and charged.
That's all I really want from this case, because there isn't enough years left for Daryl Choate to suffer. in my opinion. Like I feel that, you know, he made us suffer.
If convicted, Lynette is no longer concerned about the who, she's only concerned about the why.
To look at him and ask him myself, why? Why would you do this to my brother?
The why is the most important thing to you over anything else.
That's what's hanging over me right now. Yes, if I could look him in the eye. I want to be there in person. I don't want to have them, you know, pipe me in on the telephone and have him tell me. I want to be able to look him in the eye and have him tell me why. Why did you destroy our family like you did? Why did you destroy the girl's family like you did? And put the fear in this town.
What will a conviction mean for you?
Closure. Like I say, I really don't care so much about the sentence because I believe, considering what he's going to be charged with or has been charged with, I think that he will spend the rest of his days in prison, whether he gets life or the death penalty. So that is not really that important to me.
Lynette has been back to the lookout site where her brother was shot many times.
That is where my brother drew his last breath.
For 52 years, she has never stopped looking for her brother's killer, and now with this arrest, she feels one step closer to closure for her and her family and the entire town of Vernal.
I told you, I promised you I would get this done. I promised you I wouldn't rest until it was done. And I'm on it. I'm on my way.
For decades, Greg Nickell's family and that of his date lived without closure. But the arrest of Daryl Choate has finally brought the possibility of justice to this case, which is a reminder that time does not erase crimes. For the victims and their families, justice is never too late. I'm Jim Spiewak. Thanks for watching.